In my previous interviews with Edgar about his book, Civilian in an Ill-Fitting Uniform, a memoir of World War II, we talked about his inspiration for the book, the reason for the title, and his feeling of duty to serve his country. That was just part one. In part two, we discussed Edgar's pure luck, and he read from his memoir. Part 3 continues the discussion of the captains Edgar served under, the, quote, winding path to peace, and the fact that bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and yet the USS Alaska hadn't suffered its first casualty of the war. Also in Part 3 at 96, Edgar reminds us with precision what was happening in the Pacific Theater and the timing and the feelings of where we were at as a country during World War II, including the difference between enlisted men and officers. Part 3 has some great information. Let's go get it. In the book, you make a specific line. What was that specific line? You use that throughout the book? Only in the Navy, or that's the way the Navy does it?
That's the way the Navy does it.
There it is.
That's the way the Navy does it. Right. Yeah.
And you were talked about your captain, Fischler, when after he left and was promoted to Rear Admiral, you had a new captain come in.
Absolutely.
And you said everything. What was the captain's name? And it was Noble's.
Captain Kenneth Noble was the second captain of the and he had been a captain of other ships. I don't know why Captain Fischler was appointed to be a captain. I made a little investigation and found out that he had had no previous command experience of any kind.
So what was the big change?
And for example, when we were in Philadelphia, we were given leave only every other day. Now that didn't make any difference to me because when we were in Philadelphia, Zella was in Detroit with the children, so it didn't matter. Going every other day was fine, but there were a lot of officers and men who had their families, and they could only see them every other day. Every other ship in the Philadelphia Navy Yard had liberty for its crew 3 out of 4 days. So that's an example of what I'm talking about. And there were a lot of other things like that about the first captain. When the second captain came in, he immediately changed all that and made life as comfortable and as acceptable as possible for his officers and his men. Captain Noble, the word describes what kind of a man he was. He was a great captain, and he knew how to handle us when we were in battle, which was very important.
In your chapter, The Winding Path to Peace, you remind us that just because you had dropped bombs, dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the rest of the world, in America, I guess, the mainland America, was thinking the war was over. You were still in the USS Alaska, and there was work to be done. So what were your feelings after you heard that we had bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Well, the first feeling when I came into the wardroom, I remember it was August 7th of 1945, was the feeling that the war was going to be over pretty soon. I don't know whether they used the word atomic bomb in the thing, but we knew it was an overwhelming example of power, military force, and we felt that there had been a phrase. The Golden Gate in 48, that was 45, and we were thinking the war might last another 3 years because we had to invade Japan, we thought. But all that changed, and we could see that the war was going to end much sooner than any of us had ever hoped.
Well, especially since you were still in the Alaska, it's been now, what was it, a couple months or so after the bombs been dropped. You're still down there?
Well, yeah, we were with the Missouri. When we went, the Missouri was the battleship on which the surrender ceremony took place in Tokyo Bay, and we were with the battleship Missouri throughout the war. We were in the same squadron, and we went on a training trip much earlier in the war. And the Missouri was selected to be the base for the site for the surrender ceremony. And we thought that we would become part of that group. And then we expected that the Missouri would sail triumphantly home. But just before that happened, we were transferred to the 7th Fleet, and we were given the responsibility of accepting the surrender of a Japanese army in Tsingtao, China, which had been a German summer resort.
Oh, okay.
And so I was expecting to go home much earlier, and then suddenly discovered I had a few more months.
A few more months, and it was during that time when you were still doing missions, flying missions, observation, just down. It was, I believe you said it was Okinawa.
Well, during the Battle of Okinawa, the only battlefield casualty that the Alaska battlefield casualty was one of our observation pilots flew off. It was on June 11th, and the war ended June 17th.
Oh, okay.
That was when Japan finally surrendered. But in that period, he flew off and never came back. He was the only casualty we had. And then also, the admiral, for some reason or other, had our ship and the battleship Pennsylvania anchor. This was before the war ended. Mm-hmm. Anchor in what was called Buckner Bay, and we were lined up like that, and a Japanese bomber came through and dropped a torpedo and hit the Pennsylvania and killed 20 men just like that.
Wow.
And we were on the inside, so we all remembered the tremendous sound it made, mm-hmm. but we were not damaged. Oh, okay. And that happened just before the war ended.
Wow, so you had a couple bad things. You're just trying to finish it off, and boom. Yeah. In the book, you talk about the differences between being an officer and an enlisted man. What are some of the privileges that you had as an enlisted man that the other men did not?
Well, I think one of the biggest differences is that we were really, as officers, we were served our meals in the wardroom, mm-hmm. in great comfort, and we had the kind of finest meals that you can imagine. If I could show you, I don't have it handy. Sometimes we would get a menu, and it was like going to the best restaurant. And whereas the enlisted men basically ate bologna.
Really? So it was like,
that was one of the differences. Another kind of difference that I was very conscious of, when we were in Philadelphia, we would get buses to go to into town. Mm-hmm. We were in the Philadelphia Navy Yard, which was out of ways, and some of the officers would, because they considered it to be their right, they would march to the front of the line in front of all the enlisted men who were standing there, and I never could bring myself to do that. I would always get in the back of the line, and a couple of the other officers whom I was with said, "That's probably a good idea. It probably makes them very angry." So it's that kind of thing that's separate. But the thing that you have to remember is this: when an enlisted man receives a command from an officer, he has to respond immediately. And so this kind of discipline and these practices were put into place to make the enlisted men realize, I presume, and of course when we were given commands, we had the same responsibility. Mm-hmm. But was to make them feel that they had to respond immediately.
So basically,
it was necessary, but there were certain parts of it that I didn't like at all.
Kind of little. Yeah. That's how the Navy does it. Yeah. The next part, Part 4, concludes my interview with Edgar E. Willis. We cover his decommission and the choices he had to make that helped change, mold, and shape the rest of his life. Don't forget, Edgar has more. Check out his book and video series, How to Be Funny on Purpose, An Anatomy of Humor. And of course, you can get Civilian in an Ill-Fitting Uniform, a memoir of World War II. Go to www.edgarewillis.com. That's www.edgarewillis.com.